Okay, so this is the audio review for Shared Meaning is the Basis of Humanness. So in the chapter, Jody O'Brien talks about how symbolic interactionists are interested in the process of assigning meaning to actions and in the responses that people have to those actions. So for symbolic interactionists, the most interesting aspects of human behavior are those that take place when we assign meaning to our actions or interpret the actions of others. So, as we talked about before, there's this idea that symbolic activity mediates between stimulus and response. So social behavior itself is really just a manifestation of shared patterns of symbolic meaning. We don't necessarily just respond to a stimulus, we have society kind of mitigating in between. So we also perceive our environment selectively, which means that we don't see everything or commit everything we see to memory. Humans don't exist in a direct state of nature. We exist in worlds inside of our heads. And those worlds are full of symbols and meaning that make sense to us because of our interactions we've had with society. So thinking itself becomes a symbolic activity because you're pairing the stimuli of what you're seeing to the meanings that you've learned through socialization. That gives you the meaning to what you're seeing. So, there's this argument that we are symbolic creatures because we're able to comprehend and comment on and really even organize our behaviors in accordance to these abstract representations in the culture. So the example they give in the chapter is flirting, right? So you don't really know a person's thought or intentions towards you because you can't read their mind. So when it comes to interest in another person, you want to know if they're going to react positively or negatively to your attention. So how do we know if someone wants us to hit on them or wants to hit on you? We typically read cues, social cues, right? So how do you know when someone likes you? Like if you're in a crowded room, how can you tell? How do you communicate your interest in someone in a public setting? What's your body language like? So again, social psychologists are really interested in looking at the signs people use to make these inferences and really the reliability of these signs for predicting the intentions of others. So there are three basic premises they talk about in the chapter in regards to symbolic interaction. The first is that humans act towards things on the basis of the meaning they assign to the thing. So this is what we were talking about before, like meaning of a tree is your relationship to it, if it's shade or if it's a material resource or something that's destroying your plumbing, right? That the meaning of it is not inherent to itself. The meaning is what our relationship to it. Their second premise is that meanings are socially derived. So there's no absolute meaning. The meanings themselves are negotiated with and through our interactions with each other. And the third basic premise of symbolic interaction is the perception and interpretation of social symbols are modified by the individual's own thought processes, meaning you still have your own perceptions and interpretations of what it is we're thinking of in these kind of schemas that we're given in the society. So they really look at the process of naming or assigning meaning that they find very interesting, right? So when we name a person, a place, or thing, we attach a meaning to it. And those three elements, that exist to the labeling process or naming process itself is creating a label. And then, of course, the cognitive and emotional evaluation of that label, right? Like what it means to us, the kind of emotions it evokes within us. And lastly, a recommended course of action based on the label. So, how do you react to it? So instead of it just being stimuli and response, like we talked about, the kind of basic, like you're burned and you feel pain, that the stimuli itself is going to be mediated through these naming processes and the meanings and emotions attached to those processes, right? Before we react, we are kind of going through a lot of thoughtful, abstract ideation. So they're saying we don't respond to the things themselves, but the process of labeling mediates between stimulus and response. So when it comes to symbols and signifying, emotional and behavioral responses to a stimulus are not reflections of the stimulus response. It's not a hardwired instinct situation because a lot of these things are very subjective, right? Our response to a lot of stimuli are really a reflection of the emotional and behavioral responses that we have because of the meanings we've associated with that particular thing. So The example that a friend of mine likes to use for this is the spit example, right? If someone spit in a cup and asked you to drink it, you would say no. But the idea of spit, so there's a difference between, in our thought process, saliva and spit, as it becomes spit when it leaves your mouth. But you're not grossed out by the natural liquids that already exist in your mouth. You're grossed out by the word spit because it has a social context as something gross. So you don't think of the saliva in your mouth as gross. You just think of spit once it's left your mouth as gross. So again, the meaning itself has everything to do with the kind of naming and labeling process of calling it spit that has made it something so that we react with an aversion to it, right? So symbols are just abstract representations. Nowadays, we're bombarded with symbols because advertisers also do research, and they know just how important symbols can be for recalling a place, or in this case, a corporation. So if you think of the golden arches, we know that means McDonald's. So some research has looked at how children at even by 18 months are able to identify some brand name logos, which is terrifying, but it shows the importance and the impact of symbols on our understanding in society. So a lot of things are communicated via symbol that supersede language. Like these corporate logos, how you memorize them and make them a part of your brain, you've largely done that without meaning to, right? The example they talk about in the book is flags, right? These are, of course, another example where it's an image or sometimes a cloth, like a physical representation, but it has meanings that are developed by the people who give it meaning. They also talk about how a symbol defines both what something is and what something is not. So it clearly delineates. So for the flag example, the American flag represents the United States, but it's also distinct and is not other flags. So it's clearly delineated from others, which is how symbols have clearly the defined meanings for us. So in the case of the American flag, it's the flag of the US, but it's also not the flag of Canada or Mexico, right? So as a symbol defines itself, you're defining both what something is and what something is not. They also talked about, she also talked about food symbolism, meaning that all societies have their own cultural systems that signify what foods can be eaten and what foods should be excluded, right? Like in our culture, even though it would be much better than the kind of environmental destruction that factory farming brings, we should eat insects, right? They have a lot more protein, they're easier to raise, etc. They wouldn't cause all sorts of environmental destruction. But culturally, it's considered disgusting. So it's not something you can really sell to people, right? So the culture really tells us what foods we can eat, what foods we can't eat, right? So there's some places where there's animals that we eat that are considered, revered in other cultures or not eaten, or there's animals that we consider non-edible, like dogs or horses or things like that, that are commonly eaten in other places. It's also, when it comes to food symbolism, your culture is going to tell you how your food should be grouped, such as like, what is breakfast food? What is lunch? What is dinner? What is dessert, right? When you should eat a certain kind of food and how you should eat it, as well as the rituals of use. So do you eat with your hands, like at medieval times, right? Do you have a specific utensil, like a fork, chopsticks, right? These things are often going to be culturally defined, how you even have this relationship to food, which it seems like a basic human experience to eat, to live, but there's so much cultural meaning imbued within it. So when it comes to symbols, experiences, and culture, again, symbols are just abstractions, right? Which allow us to remember, plan, fantasize, and have these vicarious experiences. So vicarious experience is just how we're allowed to learn by observing the actions of others. So if we're smart, we can learn from others' examples, right? Instead of having to make all the mistakes ourselves. So we can read a book, we can hear about someone's experience, or even watch a film and comprehend what someone else is experiencing, right? And so vicarious experience is a key element in individual survival and in the transmission of culture. Because if we can relate to one another, we can then kind of form around these collective ideals. If we didn't have the ability to step into another person's shoes, it would make it very difficult to have kind of any sort of coalition. So language is another huge part of our understandings within symbolic systems of meaning. So language is just a system of symbols that allows humans to communicate and share meaning, which of course gives us the capacity to be social creatures. Because if we didn't have a shared upon or agreed upon shared language, it'd be very difficult for us to understand each other and communicate. So words are just symbols that denote the meaning of something, and also, as they argue, represent the range of human activity. So if you think about the words we use to explain our internal emotions, there's a future reading about metaphors that we'll get to later, where there's a lot of examples of how we use metaphors to understand our complex emotional selves. We relate our emotional experiences to other concrete experiences so we can kind of have a shared effect that other people can understand. The important thing that we'll get to that later, but the important thing is that words give meaning to our specific experiences. So when it comes to how we experience things that affect us, they're filtered through our societal meanings. So, for example, being anxious and anticipating something you want to do have the same physiological responses within your body, but one we regard as negative, right, anxiety, and the other is positive, anticipating something you want to do, because it's our relationship to the stimuli that makes the difference, right? Another thing they talked about too were parallel examples. So how you can understand the power dynamics or inequalities or differential understandings of different groups through pairing-like examples. So how does a society look at a bachelor versus a spinster? Though I don't know if anyone says spinster anymore. Maybe they just say cat lady, right? It's, again, the same social condition, which is being older and single, but the gender stereotypes, the roles and expectations of society affect how we interpret that single person, right? So again, when it comes to language, this affects our social behavior, because we interact with others and we steer our behavior according to our interpretations and expectations of others. Without language, we'd really be unable to assign meaning to our actions or to have societal meanings and expectations. So this is where socialization comes in. So it's important that children learn language by what is called critical periods of development, right? Or the capability for developing that language is forever elusive to that individual. So is the case of Jeannie, right? That I'm going to show you a little video clip about for this week, that she was found at the age of 13. She was severely abused and neglected. She was chained to a potty chair all day and locked in a crib with a chicken wire lid all night. She was excluded and left alone most of the day and wasn't often talked to. And they also assumed she was beaten when she made noise, which is why she developed this very silent capacity. So there's more about her experience, again, in that film clip I'm going to show you. But, obviously they were really interested to see, since she was 13 and already past the critical period to develop language, if that was something that she'd ever be able to do. And at first it seemed very promising as she was able to develop a wide vocabulary, but language and grammar is not vocabulary, right? Words are not the same as sentences. And, basically there's a lot of argument that, your brain development has certain critical time periods that if they're not reached before that, it's very difficult to ever develop those skills otherwise, right? This is also why it's so much easier for children to learn new languages versus as an adult. If you're like me and you've ever tried to learn a language as an adult, it's like pulling teeth because you haven't set up the capacity in your previous socialization to already know those building blocks of the language, right? So anyway, the video is going to get into that. So they also talk about aphasia, or like other neurological disorders that result from damage to the language centers of the brain, which make it so that people cannot communicate in the same kind of way, and how that really is something most of us take for granted, the way that we're able to socialize and understand through the shared process of language. Because language, again, it not just affects our social behavior, but it also affects our thoughts. So the full power of language derives from the human ability to employ rules and to convey meaning without necessarily being aware of the rules. So when I teach 308, writing, I encourage students to read their paper out loud, because often you can hear errors that your eye corrects for you when you're reading. So you don't need to know all the rules of grammar and sentence structure to write something. And you can often tell if it sounds right or wrong from your experience working within those language rules. So you don't have to memorize them all. You actually know a lot more of them than you'd think. Linguistics refer to the ability to make statements that are understood by others. They call it the generalizable property of language. So different languages entail distinct patterns of meaning. And of course, languages influence culture in their labeling and attaching meanings to those labels. So there's arguments between theorists as whether language is innate or socially produced. Chomsky argues that there's a lot of evidence that shows the brain is hardwired for language acquisition, while Pinker argues that people know things independent of the words used to express them, and that language itself is pretty ambiguous. So we're going to get a little bit more into Chomsky in a minute, so we'll kind of do a deep dive into his theories. And when it comes to our thought and social interaction as a basis of language, our capacity for abstraction and computation that's necessary so we can produce language might be something that's innate to us, but the actual content that we learn is really coming through social interaction, right? That you might have a capacity to develop language, but if you were like Jeannie and you were excluded for many years and weren't able to actually interact, you would not develop that language skill, right? So the social process of language that they talk about is how adults teach children language, but through this language, it's really just teaching them what to think about certain things or how to respond to certain things. So, you respond to pain physiologically, but the culture also tells you how to feel about pain, right? So, like, let's say you fall and hurt yourself, right? If you're a small child, then you're probably going to get a lot of parental attention for doing such a thing. If you are a skateboarder, you're going to be expected to do that as part of the sport. So how you respond to it, it's not just your physiological response, but also the cultural response that you have to it. All right, so Chomsky. So Chomsky is saying that language sets up our social realities. And, he also, other than being like a foremost linguist that has, kind of changed the way that people have looked at language acquisition and what language means to society, he also just on the side, in his spare time, supposedly spare time, he's also written like 100+ books on politics and media and all these other kind of things. And he really looks at the linguistic power to socialize and affect people's behavior, meaning that when you control someone's mind, you can often control their behavior. And he does this, or he looks at this through a process that he calls manufacturing consent, right? He argues that there are a lot of things in society that we don't necessarily consent to. So through the media channels, we are programmed, right, to consent to different things because of the way that it's framed and labeled and the emotional attachment produced with those labels. So I'm going to show you a little video clip here that will actually make that a little bit more clear, but just to give you a little taste of some of his principles of that concept.
Beep, beep, beep.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian through the lens of the Western media. Press freedom, freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their end game, profit. And so it's in their interests to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources, stray away from the consensus, they get flat. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
Okay, so what's the connection between experience, perception, and conceptualization? So for Vygotsky, children make sense of their environment by grouping things and objects together, right? That was his argument, that we group things together that seem in our experience to be connected. And the result of this process is a complex thinking, right? Where you group seemingly related things into complexes or concepts, and then you generalize from them, and they often stand in as abstract representations of the relationships between concrete things and experiences that you see. So children can learn vicariously through language, meaning, they don't necessarily have to burn themselves on a stove to learn that it's hot. You can say stoves are hot and should not be touched. And, that's kind of, hopefully if they can learn vicariously, they don't have to actually burn themselves to learn that. So we all develop a lexicon of experientially based, but socially influenced names, right? That compete with our evaluative action codes. So again, stove is hot, right? So our concrete experiences are what enable us as children to comprehend, right? Because we actually do experience the social world. But without the pre-existing language, a child could not make sense of their experiences in a more generalized way. So how this relates to thought and culture. Language is structuring perceptions and experiences. In learning the customs and belief systems of culture, people learn to classify humans in all sorts of ways. So when it comes to categorization, we navigate our way through life by making categorical assessments and responding to the information contained in the category as we've previously learned it. So in the category classroom, it evokes a certain set of behaviors, right? You have an expectation of what that's going to be like, what it's going to look like, what it feels like. And that's a good way that we're able to organize the concepts within our brain so we know what we're seeing when we're interacting with the world. But the downside of categorization is mindlessness or behavior that's just based on unconscious or semi-conscious routine, where we kind of stop actively thinking and just kind of go on default. So stereotyping is part of this, these default assumptions that there's a lot of, in all languages, there's some suggestion of categorical relationships that are based on certain symbols. So Hofstadter was looking at stereotypical thinking in default assumptions that we have, these preconceived notions about how things should work and how people should act in any given situation. But there's often racial and gender and class and all these other assumptions in the culture that can be reflected in what social roles we expect for different groups. So if I say nurse, who comes to mind, right? There's a gendered aspect to that. How about pilot, doctor, criminal, right? All of these meanings are filtered through racial, class, gender, and all these other stereotypes. So they kind of, unfortunately, can lead to kind of a mindlessness where we disregard things that haven't already come into our consciousness. So when it comes to cultural hierarchies, stereotypical thinking obviously affects cultural hierarchies and creates language asymmetries that reflect the power differences or hierarchical differences. So the book gives an example of Mr., Mrs., and Miss, M-I-S-S, and the asymmetry of that language that suggests that a woman's marital status is significant information while a man's marital status is not, because either way, if he's married or not, it's Mr. So second wave feminists created the term miss, like MS, as an effort to balance out this asymmetry, to simply refer to a woman and not to denote her specific marital status as what's so important to her.